Well, good afternoon. You're supposed to say good afternoon. My name is Roland Anglin. I'm the Dean of the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs. And I am so happy to kick off this forum and welcome you. It's the Smart City Cleveland Forum, and it's brought to you in partnership with IDC and the Cleveland Foundation. Now, I'm just going to get off the stage because this is exciting stuff. To say that information technology has changed our world is kind of like saying the Beatles changed popular music. It's self-evident, and you don't need to say much. But I have to say it, and as a college, we have to reckon with it. We have to reckon with it because it's changing governance. It's changing how we view cities. It's changing how we view how we govern ourselves, and among other things. So we have to look at it, analyze it, and figure out what it means for our graduates and our stakeholders. And so today, Leon Wilson, who is the Chief Digital Innovation and Chief Information Officer at the Cleveland Foundation, is going to come up and introduce our august panel, and we're going to have a rip-roaring discussion about smart cities. So Leon, it is all yours, and thank you.
Thank you, Dean Anglin. And good afternoon, everybody. As Dean Anglin mentioned, my name is Leon Wilson, and I'm the Chief of Digital Innovation and Chief Information Officer at the Cleveland Foundation. And in that role, I'm working closely with a number of our local partners, both in the city, throughout the county, and so forth, to better understand how can we within Northeast Ohio address and support this particular endeavor of being a smarter city. And it's kind of interesting because I just left a conference last week in Kansas City, hosted, I think, in partly by IDC, where this was all the conversation about smart city, and one of the comments, and I'm hoping I'm not stealing any particular presenter's quote, but one of the biggest takeaways that I took was the Chief of Innovation for Kansas City, and I actually tweeted it, where he said, in about 10 years, we won't be using this term smart city. That by then, you'll just be a city, and it'll be the expectation that you're incorporating, that all cities are incorporating various forms of smart city kind of concepts and technologies. And those that don't will kind of be relegated to that same moniker of being treated as a Rust Belt city, just with the additive of now being a digital Rust Belt city. And he kind of joked about being a Rust Belt city sucks because it now challenges you economically from an economic development standpoint. It challenges you from a talent development. It challenges you from a growth perspective. So 10 years isn't a long time that we will cease talking about smart cities because we're just doing it. So I'm really excited to hear from the various presenters that we have before us on this particular topic, what their perspective is on it, and then we have some additional discussants that will chime in on that conversation for that, and then also make sure that we have ample opportunity for you in the audience to give some conversation and add some content to this matter as well. So our first presenter is Ruth B. Yesner. She is the Vice President of IDC Government Insight and the Global Director of the Smart City Strategies practice at IDC. Ms. Yesner coordinates the Smart City team and Smart City research worldwide. Her research discusses the strategies and execution of relevant smart city technologies and non-technology best practices, such as governance, innovation, partnership, and business models essential for smart city development. Ms. Yesner's research includes the Internet of Things, or you will hear the acronym IoT, big data analytics, cloud computing, mobility, and social media in public works, transportation, public safety, smart water, community engagement, and open data initiatives, quite a bit. Ms. Yesner's contribution to consulting engagement is to support state and local government with their smart city strategies, as well as with various IT vendors, overall smart city market strategies. Ms. Yesner joined IDC following work as a product manager in internet startups in Silicon Valley. Prior to that, she worked in state social services as a director of programs serving young adults and adolescents diagnosed with substance abuse and mental health issues. She holds a BA from Wesleyan University and graduated summa cum laude from Boston College with an MBA and MSW joint degree. Our second presenter, Mark Zanonini, is a research director for our Smart Cities and Transportation at IDC as well, focusing on global transportation issues, key and emergency transportation technologies, and smart city ecosystem. Mr. Zanoni brings 25 years of global urban transportation experience to his research, with perspectives and insights gained from both the public and advisory sectors, from works in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, and across the U.S. He began his career with the New York City Transit Authority, and his transport expertise spans a broad range of transport modes, from the traditional transportation such as aviation and subways, to futures such as autonomous vehicles, which we've all heard about, and drones, which you've also all heard about. Mark's core research area includes mass transit, smart parking, connected vehicles, V2X, and you'll ask him what V2X stands for, and transportation infrastructure in context of transportation innovation, unmanned aerial vehicles, global trends, economic development, and regulatory issues. Mark is a native Clevelander. Yay, Mark. And is based here. He holds a BA in history from Boston University and a master's in urban planning from Columbia University. And then our final presenter is someone I've had the pleasure of working with regularly here in Cleveland. And although they wrote it in there, it's actually true. My quotes. So Dorothy Bonnick is the Chief Executive Officer of Digital C. Dorothy has been involved since the early days of Digital C, when it was formerly known as One Community, and prior to that, One Cleveland, and has served several years on its board, including as board chair. Dorothy is a seasoned community and business leader with broad experience in organization and community development, strategic leadership, entrepreneurship, technology commercialization, business, and early-stage capital formation. The founding president of Nortech, Dorothy has a 30-year track record of successfully creating, transforming, and leading organizations that are part of today's Greater Cleveland and State of Ohio's nationally recognized technology and innovation ecosystem. Her most recent work involves assisting to create a water technology and innovation strategy, assisting to create a water with the Cleveland Water Alliance and Digital C. Dorothy is a native Clevelander and holds an MBA from Case Western Reserve University, a Master's of Science degree in Biology from the University of Dayton, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Biology from Wittenberg University. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Ruth B. to the podium to begin her presentation.
All right, so welcome. I'm really happy to be here speaking to all of you. I'm excited for the panel discussion. I will admit I've never been on a panel with discussants, so I'm really interested to see. Welcome to academia. Yeah, exactly. So I'm really excited, and I'm really excited. It seems like we have a mix of people in the audience, so I'm really excited for the Q&A as well. So is it up? Okay. So I'm going to be sort of giving an overview of how we think about smart cities and how we think about accelerating the digital transformation of our urban environments. And I think you heard in my introduction when you were so nicely reading out my resume that I really have a background in social work and business. So a lot of what appealed to me when I was starting the Smart Cities practice at IDC, which has historically done a lot of federal business and been very involved in IT and data-driven sort of IT research, was this combination of IT and communications technology that has a community and environmental impact. So that's really what we're going to talk a lot about today. So the theory of smart cities has really been sort of slow to catch on. I launched the Smart Cities practice in 2011, and that was after several years of research. And really the US was kind of holding back in terms of embracing and understanding what we were talking about. Europe was really kind of moving forward initially in the early stages. But now I think we can see that the theoretical discussions around smart cities are really moving towards a reality and not just a marketing term. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is that reality, talk a little bit about some research we've done around worldwide and regional trends beyond the US, and then briefly talk about the next steps for the future, which I think the rest of the speakers are also going to be talking about the current reality and the future as well. So I think that will tie in nicely. So what is the smart city reality? First, we have to look at the fact that the world is more urbanized than not urbanized, as I'm sure that you are all in studying cities and urban affairs realizing. And the concentration of people and wealth is happening disproportionately in cities, but not equally. And so one of the things that we have to look at is how we can use technology to solve some of the problems that have really been age-old issues, and that simply building and simply using traditional methods really isn't going to work for us anymore. So we see cities actually becoming really internationally competitive with each other as we have this global economy, trying to attract businesses to locate there, trying to attract taxpayers to live there, while they struggle with the fact that they often are growing quite rapidly. Here in the US, this is happening as well. Lots of people moving to the cities, the populations are growing, it's straining the infrastructure, it's straining the services, and there needs to be a way of resolving that, and it can't just be to build more roads, for example, right? We only have so much room, we only have so much money. So is there a way we can use technology to address some of these challenges? And I just want to say, in the eye of all of this disruption, we have to keep this layer of equality and accessibility in mind. I think it's really key for smart cities. You can't be a smart city if you're purely digital, but not everyone can access your digital services because not everyone has a mobile smartphone or not everyone has internet access. So I think it's important to keep that context as well as we start to talk about bringing technology into our fabric, is how that impacts people accessing traditional city services. Oops, sorry. So at IDC, when we talk about smart cities, we have a definition that says a smart city is really undergoing digital transformation of a broader urban ecosystem for specific outcomes, for environmental, financial, and social outcomes. And really the key point here is to say, when we talk about smart cities, we're talking about transformation, and that's actually what makes this so complicated, right? You can't just transform and make big changes easily or simply, especially to large, complex systems that often cross city boundaries into neighborhoods and other areas. And really, it's all about the outcome. So it's not investing without having an idea of what you're investing for and what the outcomes are going to be. And I really try to drive that home because there is a tendency to just want to say you're doing smart cities and want to be innovative and to start investing in things and not actually think about what's the actual outcome of that investment going to be on your community, and is it a positive, negative, what's the long-term effect? And I will also say that a lot of the business models and investments that are happening actually don't always come just from the city. So when we see, for example, some of the models around connected lighting, that's really happening with the utilities and possibly some telecommunications providers updating the infrastructure of lighting and providing new services. And it may be that the city isn't investing at all. Some of the models also are to bring in smart kiosks that are on the street. And the model can be that they're going to put the kiosks in, no investment from the city, they're going to pay for it by advertising. So we also have to look at who's paying for what and what's the model of these new services in the city, because it's not always coming just from the city budget. And that also makes things sort of interesting. So the larger trends that are affecting smart cities progress are really this idea of, if you're transforming, you're trying new things, you're being innovative, it means you're taking risks. And if anyone knows government, taking risks is not the thing that they like to do. No government leader wants to have a failed project, waste taxpayer money, have the newspapers pick it up, get in trouble, not get reelected, etc. And there's a lot of risk here. There's a risk of actually standing still and becoming sort of this digital rust belt, right, where everyone moves ahead of you. And there's a risk of moving too quickly without thoughtfulness. And then there's really specific risks, like digitizing everything without good security and having big attacks like we saw in Atlanta recently with their ransomware attack, going ahead without considering privacy issues. So there's lots and lots of issues around connecting things and data flows and all sorts of other things that are really challenging cities because they can't move forward fast enough and they don't want to stand still. And what's interesting when we see this is procurement is playing a large role in affecting the progress of cities. For those of you not in government or maybe students, you cannot begin to understand the painful nature of government procurement. We have so many policies and rules and things in place for procurement that it is impossible, it is so slow and so cautious and careful to make sure that there's no bias and there's no corruption. Great, we love that. But really, when the pace of technology is fast and the procurement is so slow, it's a real inhibitor to some of the progress. And it's also an inhibitor to small companies being able to participate because it takes so much resources often to do procurement. So we're seeing procurement as this inhibitor, and at the same time, we're kind of seeing it as something that's people are getting innovative about because it's an inhibitor, and they're almost using procurement as policy. So we recently heard at this event in Kansas City, the mayor of San Francisco stood up and said, I'm against the net neutrality repeal. I'm putting out a big RFP to build up broadband in San Francisco. I'm enforcing in my procurement that the vendors who respond have to uphold net neutrality. And so we start to see procurement being used as a way for policy to be implemented in urban environments, which is really interesting. And then again, there's this idea of testing new business models, different investments. A lot of these come around, we're going to monetize the data, and nobody knows actually how to monetize the data. I don't even know what that, I'm supposedly a smart cities expert. I don't know what monetize the data means. Apparently it means you can flow data and you can capture it and somehow you can use it to make money. But if you actually ask people how they're doing it, it's very kludgy. So that's another trend that I would say is making wavy lines in terms of this progress around smart cities. So ultimately what we're aiming for is looking at technology that actually can deliver some outcomes. This means, as I said, tying IT investments to outcomes and measurable goals, finding some trusted partners that can help you innovate but manage your risk, or be that supplier to cities, and using the ability to share and aggregate data in careful ways. And that is becoming technologically a big discussion around open data policy, data sharing, open APIs that allow data to be used from different systems. And somehow that is going to, I think, solve some of the problems with government silos and help us monetize the data eventually once we figure that out. So one of the things we did at IDC is we said, okay, there's this big complex transformation. We know that cities kind of have to march along and make progress. Can we look at them and think about what the roadmap might be? So we actually researched 2 years this topic, looking at the different suppliers to cities, different cities around the world, and we realized we were sort of able to categorize different phases of city development. And we called this a maturity model. And we said, okay, if we can understand a maturity model, then we can help cities assess themselves, and we can help them march along a path of progress. So that's what this shows. It sort of shows our 5 stages of maturity, starting with ad hoc, which is this very tactical, maybe different departments doing little initiatives. There's not really a centralized strategy. There may be not policy or guidelines around what people are doing with technology. And it goes all the way up to this made-up phase that I created called Optimize, which is sort of like nirvana, right? Where everything is sustainable and it's all citywide organized and budgeting is collaborative. And that's sort of where we're heading. And nobody's really there yet. So in talking about what smart cities are in terms of the reality, we wanted to show you a little bit when we survey the cities and give them some self-assessment tools where they fall on this roadmap. So this shows some data that we have on US maturity over time. So we surveyed a total of 500 cities. We looked at them in 2014, and we saw that, as you can see in the blue bars, most of them are in this ad hoc and opportunistic stage. That means very early stage, again, not these systemic views of things, not projects that are working together, you might have a video camera on a street collecting data for the police department, and you might have another camera 2 feet down that's looking at traffic violations. So the ad hoc is a little bit that little scattered projects all over the city with not a lot of vision and strategy and governance around it. And as we go forward, we can see that becoming more citywide and more systemic. So what's interesting is in 2016, there was actually a marked change, right? The ad hoc went down pretty low, and you started to see a real proactive focus on strategy and trying to move forward with projects for U.S. cities. And it's interesting because my theory is that the U.S. DOT, the Department of Transportation Challenge, are you all familiar with that? Anyone? Okay, so some of you are. So United States Department of Transportation put out a Smart Cities Challenge and basically said, we're going to give $50 million to the winner. And if you can come forward and give an intelligent transportation strategy and how you're going to transform your urban environment using transportation, you'll be able to win this money. Columbus won, I'm sorry to say, if you guys have a healthy competition with Columbus, I'm assuming. But what's interesting is it forced the 78 respondents to put together a strategy. And once they put together the strategy with a whole bunch of people and invested months in doing it, a lot of them said, well, we didn't win, we're going to implement our strategy anyway. And so I really think that that was one of the big things that changed the U.S. and drove them forward to really start to think strategically about smart cities and technology. And so what we see now is a growing number of, I know this is really hard to read, and I apologize. We packed a lot on one slide. But what this is showing is the growing number of smart projects that we've been tracking. And we kind of bucket them into economic development, civic engagement, sustainable planning, those big bars on the right, and then group those into initiatives, which is that middle column. And then ultimately the rest are these projects. And that's kind of the siloed project-based work that most folks are starting on, right? They're starting with maybe a non-revenue water management project or water quality monitoring or smart parking, and they're doing these little starter projects. And these are the ones we see as being invested in most heavily over the next 1 to 3 years. And I would just point out education and healthcare are not on this slide. There's only so much we could fit on here. But as you can see, there is a lot more investment in projects starting to happen. And it's clear why, because we can see a lot of results from these projects. We can see when people convert, for example, to LED lighting, that there are tremendous operational and energy savings. LED lights last 8 years longer than regular lights, which means you don't have to waste a lot of fuel costs and employees on maintenance. They use a lot less energy, which is huge cost to the city. And so just in converting to LED, you can get a lot of savings. And then when you consider connecting these lights and having sensors and other things that use that infrastructure on them, maybe for environmental sensors or noise sensors or other things, you start to realize you can leverage that infrastructure for a lot of different use cases in a city. So this is sort of some example of the results that we've seen happen when people start to put this technology on cars and on infrastructure and start to connect things and use the data to manage different types of operations. One of the challenges in this smart cities reality is that this is really forcing new people and new organizations to work together that haven't traditionally been involved with each other. And I think some people kind of find this surprising, but it hasn't always been the case that GE, which was a traditional lighting company, right, and they do healthcare and all sorts of other things, was necessarily working with a city on a connected outdoor lighting project that also involved AT&T. That's what's happening in San Diego. AT&T and GE were not working together before. It's not usual necessarily that the water department may always be working with a transportation department and emergency management and a sensor technology company. So all of these combinations that have to come together to implement these projects are really interesting. And we see academia becoming more and more involved too, is because they can involve a lot of data science and other skills with the cities that they have a hard time capturing. So what are some worldwide and regional trends, sort of staying at this really high-level view of smart cities? So you will see, I think recently another firm came out with the smart city opportunity globally was $2 trillion. I don't know what that includes, to be honest. That's an enormous number. We have it at around 80 billion. So as you can see, there's wide variety of opinion here in terms of what the actual spending by cities in the urban ecosystem will be. And I don't know that that's that important, except it really does attract an investment and interest if you can show that there's a market there. So that's what we try to do as well. And so what you can see on this map is what percent the big regions are. So 33% of that 80 million is the Americas. EMEA is 25%, so that's Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And then Asia Pacific, including Japan, is also 43%. And you can see that Western Europe makes up the bulk of EMEA, US is the majority of the Americas, and China is the majority of Asia Pacific. Not super surprising. And what you also see is that worldwide transportation and public safety are really key priorities. There are other priorities clearly. People are very interested in the environment, they're very worried about water, they're very worried about sustainability, but where they tend to spend their money is on things that impact people that the community also really cares about on a daily basis, and that's things they can see, and that's the fact that they're stuck in traffic and they can't find parking and they feel unsafe in certain neighborhoods. And so we see that very clearly as a key priority around the world. Number one investment area is intelligent traffic and transportation. Number two is fixed visual surveillance. That means cameras that stay in place as opposed to body-worn video police that walk around with cameras on their vests. And then third, outdoor lighting, which is really interesting because that's becoming a sort of platform for all sorts of other sensors. High growth areas are things like officer wearables, censored vests, censored holsters, censored guns, body-worn video. All this augmented and wearables things is really coalescing around public safety. Also, VDX connectivity, which is vehicle to anything connectivity. The fact that your car can now be this little internet hotspot and has LiDAR and all sorts of other technologies that connect to things around it. And then we also see interesting use cases emerging around censored trash collection, which actually is a huge expenditure for cities, being able to tell fill levels and proactively plan scheduling, and also these smart kiosks, so things that are on the street that offer public Wi-Fi and journey mapping and local advertising. And I just want to make a point here about risk, because the fixed visual surveillance, and I think I have it on the next slide, China spends the most on fixed visual surveillance. And I think this is a really interesting demonstration of how different people can use different assets. So one of the things that we see in China, which also has done a lot with facial recognition technology, is really using these fixed visual surveillance in some communities to track people and even target certain groups to be questioned or to be followed more closely than others. And it was very interesting because Mark was at a conference where someone from South Africa came up to him and said, "You're talking smart cities, I just think you're talking about surveillance and infringing on people's rights." So I think this is where you see some of that risk, right? You can say, this is great, they're investing in surveillance and public safety and all sorts of things, but it has a lot of opportunity to be used in other ways that we have to really take care about. Ultimately, this is what, the spending reflects people's priorities, right? So the U.S. has a lot of traffic, a lot of roads, not a lot of public transit infrastructure. We spend a lot on in-car cameras, especially in police cars. As I said, China really focused on public safety. They spend a lot on surveillance, whereas Japan, which has had the nuclear reactive and tsunami, spends a lot more on environmental monitoring. And Europe, which is historically much more mature in how they use their cities, really bringing the ecosystem together, really strong rules about data privacy and protections. They spend a lot more on sort of the regulatory side, permitting and inspections, and creating platforms to pull data together. So I think that's interesting because you can see where you spend reflects sort of your priorities as a community as well. So just to wrap up, next step for the future, I think one of the interesting things is and this is my second to last slide. When I show all those use cases and we start to think about all these projects, it is very easy to think project by project is the way to go. We can, have a better lighting system. I can have a mobile app for parking, and there's all these little piecemeal projects that can impact my life. That ultimately is not where we want to go, right? What we really want to think about is having IT mimic the systemic way an urban environment behaves. So an urban environment has all the systems interconnected, right? The lighting is on your street, and the water and everything else could impact you. If there's a water break, it impacts your congestion, and there might be an emergency, and it's going to impact all sorts of things, school bus routing. So what we're trying to do is take those initial projects and structure and architect them so that they ultimately can be connected to other projects, so that you can have a systemic view and a system of systems that's supported by technology, as opposed to little projects that are all separated doing their thing. So this is what this is showing. It's showing it for a car. I have the exact same slide that has this asset as a light, and I have another slide that has the asset as a building. Doesn't really matter what the asset is in many cases. The car can now be connected by the internet and by sensors to other things. It could be connected to parking, it can be connected to other cars, it can be connected to light bulbs, so it becomes a smart and connected asset. Internally, it's got all sorts of sensors telling about predictive maintenance and all sorts of things. So it becomes a smart connected asset. And ultimately, it starts to be connected to other things in the transportation system. So like I said, it can maybe tell you where there's parking, or you're going to have a mobile device that logs in, and it can tell you where your favorite restaurants are. And it connects to the transportation infrastructure. But ultimately, we want it to have all the systems connecting with each other in some way that really smooths out the operations of some of these systems, and IT starts to support that systemic view. And so, and I'm going to rapidly speed up here because I'm running over time. I think when we think about the future, next steps of the future, what we can really prepare for is more disruption and more innovation. We see ride-hailing as a big disruptor. We see autonomous vehicles on the horizon as a disruptor. We see a lot of issues around the data economy and monetization that's going to change things. There's even things like augmented reality, and that's going to impact public safety and other things. So basically what we tell cities are, you have to start thinking about how this is impacting your operations and your revenues, because for sure there's a lot of disruption on the horizon. And these talk about them somewhat specifically, which we don't have time to get into today. So the conclusions are, there is a tremendous opportunity for smart city suppliers and for the cities themselves, but this really requires a lot of partnerships, and it really requires the ability to share data and have an open IT where systems can interact with each other, which can be really hard. And the other piece that's really hard is that you have to be able to scale these small projects. And how do cities fund that? How do they architect that? That is also a big challenge. But there is the opportunity to leverage existing infrastructure for many different types of projects. And so I think that's a really great opportunity to look at for the future as well. And with that, I am finished. All right, thank you.
Okay. I'll make sure I stay on time. I'll put this up. That's okay. I have a timer here. I think so, yeah. All right, thank you, everybody. And thank you for being here. So I work with Ruth B., and she gave you the overview of where we are with maturity and the developments and challenges of smart cities globally. I'm going to focus on a few specific use cases in transportation and outside of transportation. I'll start with smart parking, which she touched on. But smart parking, for those of you who are not familiar, has like 4 or 5 main components. So people drive around looking for parking. It adds congestion to city streets, and people drivers suddenly stop or do a U-turn, drive dangerously looking when they find a parking spot. Well, smart parking can tell a driver on their mobile device where an open space is, and this can be done either using a sensor in the spot, or it can be used by analytics by a parking system knowing where people have paid. So I was talking to somebody in Paris, like, for example, in Los Angeles, they'll know which spots are open based on the sensors being occupied or not. But in Paris, they said they don't care about that because by the time you get there, one block over, it's too late, the spot is gone. So they'd rather give you the likelihood of a spot being available. But anyway, so with smart parking, it gives you the likelihood of a spot being available, it gives you the ability to pay for your spot via your phone, and also that if you're, let's say, in a meeting, and your meeting's running late, at 15 minutes, rather than leave and run outside to pay the meter, you can just add 15 more minutes on your phone to your parking session, and you'll still be paid up. It supports enforcement, so traffic police don't have to drive around looking for a car that's about to expire. They can know where to go, or some smart parking systems can develop a system for traffic enforcement people and parking enforcement people to develop the path of the best, most efficient way to find these vehicles. And finally, analytics for cities. You'll know the average duration of a parking session, where people park. You can affect transit and parking policies and transportation policies with it. But also, you can also then have dynamic pricing. So you can, if you want to incentivize people to park on a certain street, let's say there's new retail on that street, you can lower prices there. If you want, or if you know there's going to be more traffic, you can move it to 13th Street rather than 12th Street, for example. In the private sector, when you have competing garages, it can be more profitable for them. They could, for example, have lower prices based on the garage across the street, or when it hits 90% occupancy, they could increase the price. In theory, you could, and no parking garages I know does this, but you could charge more for parking on the ground level or parking near a elevator. You can use it to enforce handicap accessibility spots. There's many things you can do with it. But for the cities, it would give you less congestion, which results in less air quality, less air emissions, and improved air quality, safer streets, and then ultimately happier citizens and people visiting your city. So this picture here is Hopkins Airport. Hopkins Airport always talks about their smart parking. But as far as I know, it just tells you if the spot is open or not. It doesn't do any payment. I'm not sure what it does about enforcement. And hopefully the city's getting some kind of data in terms of like duration of usage and occupancy. But it's not the classic smart parking. That's the picture from Hopkins. Another aspect of smart cities or transportation element is smart intersections. Most cities have they use a magnetometer under streets, so it'll change the traffic light based on the occupancy of if there's a car present. Although I don't know if the city of Cleveland has that, because I've stopped at red lights all the time in Cleveland on the avenue when there's no car on the side street, and I have to wait through the light cycle. So that's not really good for the environment because you have to stop and go again. So there's more air emissions. But it's also inefficient for the driver to have to stop for no reason, unless it's for speed control. So with dynamic signaling, the system would identify not only if there's a car there, but the length of the queue of the vehicles, and then change the signal, the red, green, yellow lights, accordingly based on the length of the queue and based on other intersections that are nearby. So that it doesn't make sense to give a green light to let 50 cars through if there's nowhere to go. So the system would know all the other intersections as well, which allows for safer streets. Such a system can also identify, pedestrians and bicyclists. It can also, for example, if there's a pedestrian that's walking really, really slow across the intersection because they're elderly, perhaps, it can keep the lights red for that one person to cross rather than just change because of a fixed cycle. And also it can allow for better utilization of, say, traffic or police, for example. Like in this city, after like certain sports events or a rock concert, you have a lot of police on the street directing traffic. Well, if you had a smart traffic system, the police could be doing police things or community police, crime solving or other things other than directing traffic. So it's a better use of city personnel as well. And and gosh, data monetization, which Ruthby touched on. You have all this information of vehicles. You can know how many pedestrians. You can count pedestrians, bicycles, types of vehicles, and this data, however it is monetized, whether it's sold to a retailer or to Starbucks, or how many types of cars are going by, or whatever, you're collecting this data. Transit is another area where there's a lot of developments. Autonomous shuttles, like 80% for a transit agency most of the time. 80% of the budget of a transit agency in the United States is personnel. So autonomous shuttles, they don't travel as fast, but there's no driver on it. And these are being tested. The University of Michigan, these are slower moving vehicles, but the University of Michigan will be testing some on their campus, and there's some on some campuses outside of Paris as well currently. Onboard sensors on buses, or for example, Rome is doing this you can look at operational performance. The command center will know where all its buses are. It'll know how fast they're going, where they're moving. It does a lot of emissions control because there's an air quality concern there. It also gives passenger information. So whether it's on mobile devices, on the web, or in bus stations, people can see exactly the time and arrival of buses. Ultra-wideband is also critical. Precise location information is critical. And I don't know if you've ever used Uber or Lyft and the driver is somewhere else, because GPS in cities isn't really effective. In some cities, especially because of urban canyoning effect or bad weather or the clouds obstructing satellites, GPS is not necessarily good for urban environments. And so a lot of times an Uber or Lyft driver will be in the wrong location because they can't tell where you are, or they can't tell where they are because of it. Ultra-wideband can give you accuracy. And an example in Bangalore, where there's a lot of traffic in India, they've created bus bays. A bus can pull off of the main traffic way to pick up a passenger. But what they're finding or believing is happening, a lot of bus drivers aren't pulling into the bus bay. And whether it's because it's harder to merge back into traffic or they just don't feel like it. So using ultra-wideband, they can see whether or not a bus is really pulling over or not, and for how long they are. And the benefit of this, though, is it's safety, so the person doesn't have to walk off the curb and into the street to catch the bus. It also doesn't hold up the street traffic, so it's better for air quality and better for traffic movement and less congestion. Also with UWB, the US DOT with the City of New York tested this in Midtown Manhattan, where GPS would put you between two avenues, and ultra-wideband got the accuracy of vehicles within 2 centimeters of accuracy in Midtown Manhattan. Mobility hubs, we're hearing more and more about how transit agencies want to be seen as mobility as a service companies, as opposed to just bus company or rail company or ferry company. We're seeing more and more of that. Somebody mentioned Kansas City, so they're opening their 3rd BRT line soon, and each station will be a mobility hub. So on the curb, it'll be bike share, car share, electric vehicle charging, information, on-time performance, those types of things will be there. So it won't just be bus stops. And finally, we all heard about the first mile, last mile issue, where people would take transit if they could, or they can't get to the bus stop or the train station. So a lot of agencies were considering using the transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, but this is true in Cleveland as well. There's a hesitancy to partner with them because they don't want to accept the liability. If they're endorsing Uber, the transit authority doesn't know that driver or that driver's behavior or the safety of its vehicle. Therefore, there's a hesitancy to partner with it. But we're seeing more and more language being written that does protect transit operators. So Pinellas County, Florida is partnering. MBTA in Boston is testing some TNCs with paratransit. But that's not the only solution. Some places are testing electric vehicle shuttles that are open air. You can hop on, hop off. Of course, that works in like heavier dense areas. Let's say, for example, downtown or University Circle, those types of areas, or Ohio City. Vehicle automation is a big area, and I won't go through all of these, but they say that 95% of all vehicle accidents are caused by driver error. And so a lot of these, if autonomous vehicles work as they're supposed to when they're working, should address a lot of these accidents. So we're seeing improved safety, improved fuel efficiency, the greater ability to share vehicles, and less land dedicated to parking, because vehicles will need to use, excuse me, in a sense, you wouldn't have to use prime downtown land for parking, because a vehicle could drop you off and then take off, or most people would own vehicles because they can share them. And autonomous vehicles are of many types. It's not just private cars, but also taxis, garbage trucks. For example, in Sweden, they're testing a Volvo autonomous garbage truck. The garbage truck with sensors can make tighter turns better with less accidents. Drivers don't have to get in and out of the truck all day, which is bad for the knees. Emergency vehicles, and even airplanes. And airplanes is important because not only does it affect airports and ground operations and ramp agents, and how do they work with a autonomous airplane, because you always see those guys in the orange directing the plane. Well, the autonomous plane wouldn't see that. But also, it changes airline economics in that once you don't have a pilot and the cost of the pilot, maybe new routes for cities can open up between cities for airlines. But there's a lot of issues with autonomous vehicles, and I'll say that I gave a whole separate webcast about this topic. It's like 30 minutes long, and it's free and it's online somewhere. So I won't go into too much detail now because it's a lot of stuff. But I'll talk about several things that cities should look at today, and one of them is liability. For example, if a city vehicle, say a person working for the water department or any department, hits a person and they're driving an autonomous vehicle, is the city of Cleveland at fault? Is the city at fault, or is the car manufacturer at fault, or is it the software? Or another example, if a regular person, not a city worker, smashes into somebody because their autonomous vehicle smashes into them, but it's because of a giant pothole that happened, or because of the paint, the lane painting wasn't accurate or up to date or faded, is the city liable? So, because everybody wants to always point blame elsewhere. A friend of mine is an IoT smart city type lawyer in Portugal, and she said all cases are decided by the law, based on the law, which is not necessarily true here. It's based on the law plus precedent. There, it's just based on the law, so you could have two completely opposite cases, where in the United States, they'll always point to a previous case. Well, this happened here, therefore you must decide in my favor because of that. So in other words, precedent is critical here. So the very, very first cases involving accidents between cities and autonomous vehicles will be critical. Therefore, cities must be very proactive in positioning themselves and seeing that the outcome of those first few cases, and it doesn't have to be in Cleveland, it could be anywhere in the country, but sets the precedent for where liability against cities lie. I also have here emergency response. So if a police, for example, if a police officer sees what looks like a drunk autonomous vehicle, how do they pull it over? What do they do? What's the police procedure for dealing with a car that has no driver? Safety, I want to mention that, as I said, 95% of the accidents are human error, but to get the full benefit of autonomous vehicles, we need more than just the sensors in the vehicle. The current automotive approach to autonomous vehicles is not to talk to the city. It's just put a bunch of sensors on the vehicle and proceed. And they're testing and stuff, but they're not really cooperating with cities. So for example, if a child is running behind a building anywhere downtown and the car is moving, LiDAR cannot see around brick. It cannot see around a wall. So that child would run, and the car would likely hit the child or the dog or the person running. If you had a sensor in the city, like a camera, it could identify the person running, calculate the trajectory into the street, and then if it's an autonomous vehicle, send that information to stop the vehicle. If it's a connected vehicle, tell the driver what's happening. In other words, there'll be communication between the two. But if you don't have that city asset, that physical infrastructure in the city that can identify that, you will still have that accident. So we won't see the full potential of autonomous vehicle safety until we have city infrastructure. The things that the automotive companies aren't really talking to the cities because this is a gigantic expense, and the cities don't have the money. So there's not a lot of discussion about it, but it's something I think we'll need to have if we have a truly safe, smart city for all users of the road. I won't go through all of these. I will talk about land use. As I said, once you have smart parking, once you have autonomous vehicles that will park a person and drop you off, there's less need for land dedicated to parking. Like if you drive down Rockwell between 9th and 12th Street, it's basically parking lot garages on both sides of the street. So you can use land in downtowns or central cities for better uses than just dedicated to land, because parking could drop you off a car and then go park somewhere else or go pick up somebody else if it's not owned by a particular person. And then, okay, so a non-transportation thing, smart lighting, with Ruth B touched on. So LED and connected lighting. So it's not just the tremendous cost savings you get from LED, but connected, which you can control remotely and program it. You can tell if an LED light is about to fail because the energy consumption on the LED light dips. You can see that remotely, therefore you can change the light or the sensor unit before it fails. So it's a better citizen service for the citizens because the light bulb is never broken or busted. And it's intelligent that it could say dim starting at say 2:30 in the morning when less people are on the street, but then if it hears somebody walking, because it has an audio sensor, it can get bright again, so it can be controlled. But also the light post itself, can be used for other things like listening devices, all kinds of smart city applications. Now, if the city owns the light post, then it could be a revenue source because it can rent the poles and rent the space. I think in Cleveland, I'm not sure if CEI owns a lot of the poles. I think they do, but Cleveland Public Power has poles as well. But it's a piece of real estate asset that cities can use. Public safety is a big part also that Ruth mentioned about smart cities. gunshot detection, there's something called Shot Spotter, which can hear when a gunshot is released. It'll know exactly what the closest location, because right now if someone hears a gunshot, a lot of people call into 911, and it's somewhere within these 3 or 4 blocks. This will give them more of a precise location, and it could give information directly to officers in the field. Combined with that are separate license plate readers, especially in the warmer months. You'll read about guns being shot in Cleveland, but every night 3 or 4 people shot, and oftentimes a car is involved. Someone will shoot at somebody on the sidewalk and then take off, and it says, according to the plain dealer, no leads. Well, if there's an ability to capture the image of a license plate and transfer that instantly to police in the field, then there's a higher chance of catching that person. There's the old saying of snitches get stitches, right? So no one's going to talk in the neighborhood. And so it's very difficult for prosecutors in the city to prosecute cases because no one's going to talk. Well, this will offer a substitute. When you don't have any witnesses, you'll have evidence because you have this data. You have a photograph of the plate, you have that car in that location at the time was at that location at the time the gunshot went off. If you can catch the person in real time, you can get a GSR residue on the shooter maybe, but at least you'll have information that car was present. At least you'll have a lead. Another thing in public safety is real-time crime centers. We can centralize all kinds of data information and then deploy it back to the field in real time. For example, New York City, NYPD had like 32 different databases they had to pull data from, which is not very fast, especially when time is of the essence. I do want to touch on one last thing on cybersecurity and privacy. With the internet era, we've done a horrible job about privacy, and things will get worse once we have billions of sensors out there. When people can break into your house through your alarm clock or your refrigerator and then get into your computer from that, or your driving records of where you've been, what you're buying, because all this is connected. So we need, as a society, not just in America, but globally, better, we need true and strong cybersecurity standards and laws. And I think the government has a big role here in pushing the laws, but it's also industry as well, and to protect privacy. There's a bill right now in Congress. It's been authored, but it's not moving yet. This is the bill, and you can find it. You can add comment to it. It's led by NIST, which is the Department of Commerce's unit that deals with science and industry. And I know it's a lot of stuff, and it's you take it as a systems approach instead of doing ad hoc things, but it is possible. Just like as this boat on the Cuyahoga here looks like it's very tough to make that turn. We all know in Cleveland that this happens all the time, this kind of a move. And so I want to say thank you, and that's my contact information there.
I'm going to bring you back to Cleveland. So this has been a great overview, and thank you, because I've been in this job about 6 months now, and although I've been on the board of Digital Sea and its predecessors for a long time, I learned when I worked with the Water Alliance, jumping off its board last year and working on the ground, it's a whole different view of the world from the ground in a particular city that has its own particular strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and where we are from the perspective of being a connected, smart city. Digital Sea has been, in the past 6 months, we've been trying to focus Digital Sea because we've been out there doing a lot of things for a long time. And so at the heart of what we're doing now is we're trying to advance technology, innovation, and data for community benefit. And I'd actually even say it's not even about technology, it's about connectivity at the heart of this. There's 3 pillars of activity. 2 of them we have really well developed based on some things that we've been doing for a while, and 1 we're really still working on. But what I do know from the time that I've been in economic development, and it's been a long time, and I started actually in the biomedical sector where we had no biomedical industry to speak of, but we did have strong research institutions. And at that time, those institutions, this is back in the late 80s, were under $50 million in research, but it was the biggest research base that we had. And we knew that other communities that had biomedical research could build industries, and so we set out to build a biomedical industry. And 30 years later, we're approaching $1 billion in research from these institutions in this community, and we do have an industry. You hear about the biomedical industry, which was non-existent for a while. I also know that in 2004, when we were looking at Nortec and what it was going to focus on, we were 50 out of 50 communities in entrepreneurship. And there was an all-hands-on-deck call to say, we've got to get out of that spot. And we started to do things like invest in venture capital, seed in venture capital. We formed Jumpstart. We went and looked at the Thomas Edison program and said we need something that has that transcends administrations and will invest at scale. And we created the Third Frontier program with our friends in Columbus. And 15 years later, we have entrepreneurship at a very different level than it was when we started at that. So one of the things I know is that you have to build on strengths, that you have to meet the community where it is. We have to know where we start with something. And we also have to have high aspirations. And also, we talked about partnerships and unique partnerships to build things. So at the center pillar of this strategy is looking at empowering neighborhoods with technology. And we're really looking at this disparity in what's going on in Cleveland, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But there's technology haves and there's technology have-nots in this community, and we've got a pretty grim set of have and have-nots from a connectivity perspective. But we're trying to address that both with connectivity and digital literacy training. We also know that in terms of data and whether you're going to monetize data or whatever you're going to do with it, that data is really driving a lot of what we do. And I was at that same conference with Leon last week in Kansas City, and the statement that I took away on that was data is the new bacon. So everybody's talking about data, everybody wants some of it, everyone wants to do something with it, but you got to beware because bacon has its faults and data has some traps as well. And so we're looking to change the culture around data in the community. And you know, if you're going to change the culture around something, you have to think about measuring, and so there's a whole data aspect to that as well. And then the third pillar that that's the least developed, but really comes from my work with the Water Alliance and talks about strengths, and where I think it was billed that I was going to talk about a smart lake. So, you know, we may not have the first smart city in Cleveland. In fact, I'd bet that we're pretty behind in the smart city rankings if we took a look at it. But I do believe that we could have the first smart Great Lake. And we could take a different perspective on the Internet of Things based on some things that are now happening with the IoT Collaborative that Nick and Nigamont are going to talk about. And the one thing that I will say is that the first smart gigabit communities that were selected nationally, Cleveland was one of the first. So we have gigabit technology in this community. So why are we doing what we're doing in that central pillar? So here's the digital disconnect. This is a map of Cleveland, and the communities in red, the neighborhoods in red, have left less than 40% connectivity. So really there's no internet access in these communities. And so to me, as I start, you know, if you're looking at data and looking at this, it's like we have these communities that in the 20th century we left behind without electricity. Because can you imagine not being connected to the internet every day? And what you do, you can't really access a job. Can you imagine trying to be a student and fill out a FAFSA form on your cell phone? So somehow we've got to get our city connected, and that's really at the heart of what we're doing. And so we are starting to connect, and these are pilot projects, hopefully not disconnected, and we know we have to think about scale, but you have to start someplace. So we actually started in a partnership with the Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority, and the first building that we brought connectivity to is on 30th and Cedar, the Cedar Tower. And we wired every one of the 152 apartments in there, and then we took in some classes on digital literacy, and this is a way to really begin to change people's lives, because that's a facility that has mainly older people, but imagine just being able to send email to your grandchildren or connect on Facebook. Or imagine being the person in the building who is worrying at the front desk if everybody's okay in all those buildings, and for the first time you can send emails, and if you haven't heard from Mrs. Jones for a couple days, maybe somebody should go up and knock on the door and check on her. And so this is a different way of connectivity than you and I would think about, but when you're digitally isolated and you've never had access to the internet or email or any of these things, it's a way to think about about changing lives. The other part of this, and we've got projects now going on in Glenville, we're looking at some projects in Huff, we're looking at a project over in the metro area, but at some point we're going to have to scale this, and there's a lot of people in these neighborhoods that are not connected to the internet. So one of the things we did is we said that intentionally we want a place where we can bring people together in a neighborhood. So we've just moved into the Midtown Tech Hive at 6815 Euclid, and if you haven't been out there, I'd welcome you to come take a tour. And this building is a building that was built in 1926. It's right next to the Dunham Tavern, built in 1824, one of the oldest buildings in Cleveland, and we've now outfitted this with some of the best technology for not only coming in and connecting every day, so it's a co-working space, and you can come in for $10 a day on the first floor and buy a pass to connect with people. You can have access to conference rooms. You can also get dedicated desks on the second and third floor with 24-hour access. But you can also take digital literacy classes there or data literacy classes. And the digital literacy classes, and you can interact with other people who are starting businesses, and we're about 20 to 25% full. We've just moved in there March 1st, still working out a few of the kinks in the building, so it's not, the punch list isn't done, but we're doing some pretty amazing things and have some folks working together. The event space there has been the most popular thing, so people are coming in and hosting meetings and events and happy hours, and as soon as we get a cafe there for the community and for me in the morning, because it's pretty miserable. I live downtown and I have to stop at this Starbucks on the way to 68th and Euclid, and as you know, there's no parking right now. And some mornings, and I'm always worried about getting a ticket in parking because we don't have any smart parking meters, and they're really not accessible, but we will have a cafe there really soon to invite the neighbors in, not only to learn more about digital literacy, but also to think about where they are, and can you think about, now that you've been connected or you know more about this internet, can you think about ways that you might be able to change your life and others in your neighborhood through technology? So our Restart program is the digital literacy program that the Cleveland Foundation funded the pilot, and this program is aimed at veterans, people just coming out from incarceration, mothers, single heads of households, and children aging out of foster care. And we've put about, and these graduations are really special because these people not only get their first 6 courses to learn how to use a computer, be connected to the internet, but after they're finished, they also get a computer that they can use. Our next graduation is Thursday at the men's shelter at 2100 Lakeside. We offer 5 courses for this, and you can go through this basic digital literacy, computational thinking. You can actually move up and get certified in some of the Microsoft trainings. We don't do this training ourselves. We actually do it in partnership with CEOGC because they also have the wraparound services to help people get access to jobs. We also work with Towards Employment and others in the community, so we're not just teaching digital literacy, but we're also giving them access to other resources. So we've taken about 152 students through this, and we are learning some things about which courses are best and what you need to offer in addition to the courses. Digital literacy is kind of a long pipeline, and it's a long pipeline even before you get into the pipeline for job training, particularly if you've never been connected to the internet. The other thing that we've been doing is we feel that there's a data literacy issue among our civic community, and we categorize that as government, not-for-profits, and foundations. And we're really focusing now on not-for-profits and foundations. But we've done these learning studios, and what we've learned is that on the data maturity curve, our organizations, nonprofit organizations, are really at a very immature stage on this data maturity curve. So before you can get to the point where you can analyze data, you really have to be collecting the right data. You have to know what data you need. You have to be able to put that data into something probably like an Excel spreadsheet, and then you may want to manipulate that data so that you can visualize it. And so we do all that data basic training, and we've been doing that. We've run about 90 individuals through with that. and in 37 organizations. And what we've decided from that is our Data for Impact team has said, you know, we know that foundations want to measure what their grantees are doing. We know that nonprofits, just because of the nature of nonprofits, want to do good work and want to have social impact. But how are we measuring that, and where are the bulk of the nonprofits on this data maturity curve? And so we're getting ready to launch a survey this summer to really figure out where these nonprofits are. We have some ideas from the 90 people we've taken through the learning studios, but really, can we target those learning studios toward cohorts of organizations that are working on similar problems? And can we really change our trajectory around how we use data in the community? So the final slide that I have here, and so we can get to some discussion. When I came into Digital C, because I came from the Water Alliance, and I sat on the boards of both the Water Alliance and Digital C, and I was so excited a couple of years ago as I was sitting in the Digital C board meeting to see what Brian Stubbs and the Cleveland Water Alliance were doing around a project called Erie Hack. And what Brian did is, and one of the great things sometimes about not getting funding from any government sources, local, state, or any place else, is that you really have freedom to think about what you want to do in an ecosystem. And so this is a different kind of system thinking, right? Because a water body, and the people here at the Urban School, particularly Wendy Kellogg, who is one of the founders of the Cleveland Water Alliance, they know that this system is based on a basin, a Lake Erie Basin, one of the 5 Great Lakes, and watersheds. And if you could think about that system and think about the cities around that system that rely on it, and we were all industrial cities built in about the same time. I mean, think about it: Buffalo, Erie, Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, Windsor, all industrial cities, and we've been using that water. We are going to have to rely on that water for the rest of our lives and our children's lives, but also we've been using that water and dumping things into it for all the years that we've been these industrial cities. And we all know we have common problems, so we went around the lake with NASA, the NASA Ideation Center, and they came with us, and we tried to identify the biggest problems around Lake Erie as a system. And to a city, I was amazed that the #1 issue that we were talking about was algae blooms. And then we talked about this industrial pollution that we've been putting in, and because we still have combined sewers, we had combined sewer overflow that we have been dealing with, and we know that our sewer district has just been spending $3 billion to correct that problem and get some green infrastructure in place. And then one of the things that was kind of a surprise to me was we've been collecting data around the Great Lakes for years, decades. But is it meaningful data, and are we using that data to do anything to mitigate these issues? And so we went around the lake, and foundations all around the lake supported this effort, and we did Erie Hack, which was this innovation challenge where 42 teams from all around the lake signed up, and they just had to address one of these issues. And most of the projects were focused on algae blooms. And from that, we have systems now where we have new sensors, much less expensive sensors than the ones that are out there, because we've been innovative about sensors detecting algae blooms. We're thinking about different platforms, different networks in terms of taking that data from all these multiple sensors and then taking it and putting it into data platforms. And then can we do something like commercialize an early warning system for these bacteria that put the toxins in the water? So not all the algae in the algae blooms are harmful, but there are some. Can we detect those early and have a warning system before those algae blooms get to an intake in the Toledo area or in the Cleveland area? And we could become the center of commercialization for smart water activity. And we thought that we were going to get a number of apps as projects, but we're an engineering community, right? We make things. And so why couldn't we be the first community or the first smart Great Lake and the center of commercialization for smart water applications? And the one thing that I keep saying is we had to build a research base to build a biomedical industry. And we had to fire up our entrepreneurial ecosystem to do it. But the Petri dish is sitting right outside our back door, and we have all the intelligence. It's really a matter of focus. And what I'm really excited about is that after we did Erie Hack, we went to the Internet of H2O, and with this new IoT collaborative and the possibility of a smart lake, I'm just looking forward to where we go next. So we do have to bring our neighborhoods and all the people of Cleveland into this activity. But I think that water is one thing we can all understand. We all want safe, drinkable water. And what better place to be the center for smart and safe water than here?
Thank you, Ruth B., Mark, and Dorothy for those comments. So there are two other individuals that are on the podium that I want to introduce so that they can give context to what was just shared with us before we open it up for Q&A. I throw in some questions as well. So first, just to Dorothy's left is Dr. Nigamat Sridhar, who is an associate professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Cleveland State University. His primary area of research interest lies at the intersection of software engineering and distributed systems, with a special emphasis on small embedded systems such as wireless sensor networks. Dr. Sridhar directs the Dependable Systems and Network Research Group, which is focused on making programming of sensor systems more accessible to scientists and researchers outside the field of computer sciences. He received his PhD and master's degrees in computer science and engineering from Ohio State University, and an MS in technology degree in information systems from Birla Institute of Technology and Science in Pilani, India. He also is a recipient of the NSF Career Award back in 2008, and he also serves as the Dean of Graduate School Admissions here at Cleveland State University. Welcome, Dr. Nigamat Sridhar. And then finally, we have Dr. Nicholas Singali, who is a postdoctorate senior executive fellow from the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, with over 25 years of academic and professional experience in public policy and management. He is a former associate professor at the University of Akron and an adjunct professor at The Ohio State University. Currently, he is a co-director at the Institute of Applied Phenomenology in Science and Technology. He has published over 80 articles in technical and academic journals. He is a 2006 recipient of the National Association of Environmental Professionals Environmental Excellence Award in Education, resulting in a USAID grant-funded project leading an innovative public policy and management program for the government of Vietnam. He teaches courses in public administration, organizational theory, public policy and government regulations, and environmental and global sustainability policy and administration. He is a local and national invited speaker on issues of governance, phenomenological inquiry, environmental global sustainability policy, and is certified as a qualified environmental professional, hazardous materials manager, and ISO environmental management systems lead auditor. He holds the degrees from Bowling Green State University, Baldwin Wallace, and a PhD from University of Akron. Please welcome both gentlemen as they're already on the stage, and why don't we allow them to basically first share their perspective on what they heard before I return in as the moderator to chime in on what the other presenters spoke.
Hello, folks. So first of all, as academics, one habit that we don't have is updating our bios, because what you just heard was old for both myself and for Nick. So we need to go do that. But anyway, thank you very much for that introduction, and more importantly, Ruth B., Mark, and Dorothy, thank you very much for your rich perspectives on this issue of smart cities. And what's coming, really, right? I mean, Leon Garrett started off with talking about, 10 years from now, the idea of a smart city isn't going to be a special thing anymore, is not going to be a distinctor anymore. That all cities are going to look smart, so to speak, right? And we've had a few iterations of this kind of thing happening with technology already. I mean, you know, in the mid 80s, late 70s, early 80s, Cleveland was actually one of the first 10 nodes on the internet, right? So Cleveland was actually node number 11 on the internet was right here at Case Western Reserve University, and then the internet came along, and everybody is now connected, and we kind of got left behind, right? And then, you know, mid 2000s, when everybody started having a cell phone in their pockets, suddenly these cell phones became little supercomputers that we're carrying around, where the first iPhone that was launched in 2007 was several orders of magnitude more powerful than the computer that flew to the moon, right? So I mean, these technological jumps and leaps have come and have stayed, right? So this idea of 10 years from now, every city being a smart city is quite a believable proposition, right? And as I heard the three presentations, and I'm clearly not going to sit here and repeat what they said because they said it much better. The one thing that stuck to me as a question is what are we going to do to frame the idea of the poverty gap as we think about this all of this technology, right? And I want to focus on a couple of things in particular. And then you know, maybe we'll get into some discussion on those things. One is has to do with we heard about data monetization and data in general, security and privacy of data, and you know, the last couple of weeks, as we've been hearing more and more about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, this becomes even more of an issue because I've been reading articles about how you know, social networking organizations like Facebook and like Twitter and so on might now go from being a free platform to potentially offering a paid platform where they don't store your data, right? So then you know, we heard a similar strand here about you know, hey, if I have a smart parking system, maybe I don't pay as much to pay close to where I'm going and walk a little further, right? So then, you know, if you take those two kinds of stark issues there, are we creating another set of red lines and keeping the people that cannot pay, the people that don't have the potential to pay, away from each other, right? So then, you know, that really becomes the central question of we can't stop the technology, we don't want to stop the technology, but how do we design the technology in a way that is inclusive and does not create rifts where they don't belong, right? So that's one thing, and actually I'll give Nick a chance to speak as well, and I have a couple other things that we can come back on if we have the time. And actually, you heard mention of one more thing, the IoT Collaborative, and I want to give a little plug to that before I let Nick come in as well. This is a new academic-based partnership between Cleveland State University and Case Western Reserve University with support, actually more than support, it's a true partnership with the Cleveland Foundation in creating this watershed, this petri dish that Dorothy just mentioned of bringing academic research from the two universities to focus specifically in the region from an economic development perspective, from a public sector perspective, as well as from a people perspective, in thinking about how the Internet of Things and technology come into play in the region, and how do we set Cleveland as the world leader in IoT innovation. So I'll leave that, and then Nick, you want to?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on the panel. I got involved with the technological related aspects of this several years ago when we were forming the Internet of Things Collaborative. And so I tend to be the contrarian in the room when it comes to these types of things. I question a lot about the values of where we're moving with data and with technology. One of the things that makes smart cities work is a fundamental belief, and that fundamental belief is that data can tell us about ourselves. And so one of the challenges that I think is complicated by where we're heading within smart cities, and I heard Ruth refer to this when she's talking about what systems within systems, is that we are constantly finding out new things and identifying new things. And this, the caution to the wind here is that data already assumes with it a prejudgment, and that prejudgment is already pre-framed when we come in to understand things. And so sometimes we have to take that time to be reflective about those relationships. To Dorothy's point, you know, data might be the new bacon, right? And I like that metaphor, but there's also something that says that we have to believe in bacon to begin with, right? And we have to understand what that bacon is to begin with. And so those types of things are become critical when we begin to do things like has been done, and we've seen recently with Zuckerberg, and who's, I think, in the House today, answering questions about privacy-related issues and the power of using data for certain things. The other thing that I want to bring up into this is that having been involved with a number of these conferences and hearing people talk about smart cities, what I've come to realize is that the stage we seem to be at along these trend lines that Ruth Bia and Mark talked about is, I feel like we're at a stage of a bit of show and tell when it comes to smart cities. So when you hear people talk about show and smart cities, you tend to hear some case studies like Mark showed, and what I sometimes see is that people, particularly city people, come walking away from these conferences and they feel defeated because there's some other kid in the room that just talked about their latest parking technology, and we sit here going, what are we doing? You know, how are we going to get there? How do I get that new bike, right? And so there is something that needs to be said about the way we approach these things from a governance perspective, and the fact that there are some cities that are ahead of us, but that choosing where we begin to move and proceed on this, it becomes critical in the way that we kind of wrap around services and governance related issues associated with this. Which brings me up this issue of governance. What I see happening within the smart cities is a hyper-accelerated governance model. And what I mean by that in the basic terms is that governance basically suggests that solutions to public problems can come from anywhere at any time. Right? This is different than the top-down model we've been conditioned to from more of a direct governance model, where government would analyze what's going on, would fund certain programs that are going on, and then those things would drive the types of solutions that we begin to focus on and work on. You know, I'm reminded, I happened to be talking to a researcher out of Ohio State that was part of the recipient of the award. And he said to me after the conference, I said, so what's going on with this? He says, you know, we really haven't figured out if this smart city, this smart transportation thing is a process or an outcome. Okay, think about that for a minute. Is it a process or an outcome? To me, this is significant because the show and tell aspect of things are about showing and telling about outcomes. And I think what we need to start doing more of is talking about the process of how folks got there. So that's one of the challenges that I have as we go into this next session is I'd like to hear more about the process, more about the failures through the process, more about the sticking points. Because right now, when we think about what's happening in the Cleveland area, that's where we're at. We're at the sticking points. We're at the process of trying to get through this kind of mucky area of moving towards a smart city, and that's what we need to learn about, right? That's what we need to learn about as we move forward. I'll leave it at that.
Great. And, yep, good, I'm good. So this is the part that I enjoy because now I don't have to have my talking points. I can just actually ask my questions. So one of the questions that I had, and again, I want to make sure we have time for people in the audience to ask questions as well, was really to you, Ruth B., because you threw a lot of stuff out regarding what's out there, who's doing what, and even from the conference that I was at, I realized that even when we use the term smart city, I've yet to see an actual full smart city. I've seen a smart block, I've seen a smart grid, I've seen a smart corridor, I've seen a smart district, I've seen a smart, micro hood, but I have not seen north, south, east, west, a full-fledged smart city. Maybe, Singapore and over there in someplace else where they actually built the city up from the ground. Given all that we have right there that you threw out there, where in the heck do we begin? Because you have the top-down approach about where we look at it from an infrastructure standpoint, we look at it from smart transportation, we look at it from smart water and waste management and so forth. But then, especially for my role at a community foundation, we're always concerned about the resident. And what does that individual person that lives in Huff, that person that lives in Glenville, that person that lives over there in Clark Fulton area, how is this going to resonate with them? How are they going to feel it? What's smart about this city for them? So what recommendations, when you talk about process versus outcome, where do we begin?
That's a really great question, and I just have to say, as I mentioned, the first time ever having discussants, I wish I had, what a treat. I mean, I just loved everything you said. I took tons of notes, and I wish we could talk on and on and on about all the things you brought up, because I agreed with all of them. So to your point, and I get asked this all the time because we did this maturity model, and I show the graph of where people are, and then somebody says, well, who's the smartest city? And who's the best at something? And it becomes this show and tell thing. And it actually, the point of the maturity model was to talk about a process. It was to show a roadmap and stages of growth and progress. And it was intended, and I actually didn't show this slide, to show what we thought were key things you should look at. And so, so I think one of the things is, at a very high level, is we start certainly with the process. And we look at some key important areas that you have to have. You have to look at your culture. You have to look at the partnership models you have. You have to look at the way you do budgeting. You have to look at who's leading your strategy for smart cities. You have to look at who's going to be there for a long time, what your organizational structures are. So those are all within that maturity model, pieces that we measure when we do it. So I think what you should start with in an ideal world is with a time taken out to create a strategy. And we are seeing that happen more and more with certain cities. But it costs money. You usually have to bring in someone from the outside. And it takes time, and it takes time from people who are operationally on the street trying to do their jobs. And it requires them to stop and do things like have a workshop to talk about mission and outcomes and to talk about policy and governance. And that's really hard for cities to do. So I think that's the starting place. A leader who decides that they want to try this out, and then rallying the community to do it. And then it involves your city employees from all departments. It involves taking a pulse of your resident and having listening sessions and doing some education and and the business community, and taking all those pieces together to come up with some vision and mission for your smart city strategy, and from that, determining what are the key areas you're going to invest in, like water. What's the thing that's going to make you special? What's the big need area that you have?
The next question that I have, and I throw it out to any one of the panelists, is when we talk about smart cities, obviously we're talking about connected cities. And when you talk about a connected city and the residents that live in that connected city, connectivity does not end when you're driving down Detroit or Lorraine or whatever, and you cross 117th, and now you're no longer in Cleveland proper, you're in Lakewood. Recognizing we talk about smart cities, but then you got multiple cities, you got many cities, or you have someone from the county, you got 59 municipalities. How are you trying to create a connected community to have a smarter city so that the experience of that resident, especially residents that are relatively transient, where they may spend half their time in Garfield Heights, the other half of their time in Cleveland proper, hang out over in Warrensville, and swing over to some other spot, that the experience that you're getting in this environment is somewhat continuous. If I'm driving down the street, I don't feel it when I cross over into another district. if I turn on my electricity, if I plug in my charger, because we all now looking for chargers to charge our phones, I don't have a different experience if I'm in one municipality versus another municipality. So when we talk about these smart city concepts, and I open up to anybody, how do we approach this where, from a residential standpoint, they're getting the same experience?
Hello? Okay. So when we say smart city, we define it as community. So I think one of our slides, Ruth's slides, said it could be a smart airport, it could be an army base, it could be a college campus, it's any community. It also could be a county, it could be a state. Like we've done some work with Virginia as a state, and we did a smart state study with Illinois. But it depends on where the initiative, where the leadership is, who's funding it. I mean, there's nothing to stop the city of Cleveland and the city of Lakewood from working together on something. In fact, you'd have economies of scale if you're combining more government forces, more funding. If it was done at the county level, there's even more funding. It could even be, 7 counties around Cleveland include, Akron Lake, Geauga, Summit, for full greater Cleveland. But it depends on where the leadership is and who's coming to the table. But I agree that the person driving, let's say from Bay Village to Euclid, along I-90 or something, he doesn't care, she doesn't care which municipality, but they still want that same service.
Piece to that question, which actually is a great question. Actually both Ruby and Mark brought this up, the idea of open data and open APIs, right? And what the heck does that mean? I mean, if we look at how individual organizations, cities and private organizations, whoever else it is, are collecting data about people, and how is it being used, right? One of the reasons, I mean, so the idea of being able to share across organizational boundaries is really, really critical for the seamless experience to open up, right? On the other hand, when data becomes easily and openly accessible and shareable, there's also this large privacy concern, right? I mean, the reason that 87 million people had their data exposed in such a short and quick fashion was because the data was openly accessible and shareable, right? So I mean, there's one of the, I think the key issues that we must tackle from a technology perspective is how do we keep the data open and shareable, and yet keep it in a place and a manner that only the people that have access to it should have access to it.
Can I just add? So I think a really good example of what you're talking about is transportation too. And we actually did a study. We were helping the European Commission because the European Commission was saying, we've got all these connected cars now who are transmitting data, and we have all these countries in the European Commission, they're very strict on data privacy, but they all have different laws. So how does a car know that they're in France and they got to follow these laws, and then drive over into Germany and have to follow these laws? And that's exactly the same in the states, right? You have different things. You can go from one state to another state, not so much with counties, but how does your vehicle know, right? Because that's the best case of when you're going to transfer lines, right? You're going to be transporting somehow. And I think it's a huge question, but I think it comes down to some sort of standards, right? I mean, you can plug your phone in anywhere because we have a standard for plugging. And we're going to have some standards like that that enable this seamless transition. And I also think it comes down to sort of this governance policy type viewpoint too, which is, who's making and setting these rules and standards, and how are they dealing with privacy when all this data is getting shared? Because it's just the point about this digital equity, which is a huge passion of mine as well, is, are you just going to make more people who can't use certain connected cars or autonomous vehicles or can't protect their data because there's a cost to everything now digitally? I think that is really, really a huge problem. And as you cross from one, it's a little bit off your question, but I had to throw it.
No, great question, and I want to actually throw one also to you, Dorothy, because I think you can answer this question. In all of this, at the end of the day, you got to have a pipe to provide the access for all these devices, for all the connectivity happen, i.e. broadband, i.e. fiber, the backbone. We got to improve our backbone. Where do we stand when we talk about the backbone so that we're able to leverage access to all this data? We're able to allow for the connectivity to happen between the cars and the street lights, and even for our residents to be engaged with their smartphones and all that kind of stuff. Where do we stand with that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Leon. Thanks. Yeah. So I think from a backbone perspective, and Nigamon pointed this out, that we were the number 11 node on the internet. So the pipe runs right through here. We're on the, I mean, just the same way that the railways were built. We're right on the main line. However, you've got to get that pipe into these communities where it hasn't been built. And by far the best way to do this is by building that fiber connection, right? But that's a pretty expensive proposition. So we at least have to get, you know, back to my electricity analogy, we at least have to get candlelight into these communities, right? So we've got a big enough backbone, I think. I don't think that's the issue. It's really driving into these communities and then meeting them where they are and making sure that we're not making their lives worse, right? I mean, what are the biggest pain points that we can address with some technology that makes life better, not worse? So.
And Mark, were you going to say something? And then after that, I'm throwing it up for questions. This will be the last one. Were you going to say anything? Well, why don't we go ahead for the rest of the time and open up for questions from the audience. This is being recorded, so we're going to ask that you wait until the mic comes to you, so that way we can pick up your question and so forth. So the gentleman that the mic has just been up there, we'll start with you.
Is this working? Yes. What Digital C is doing sounds very commendable and very necessary, but the part about the digital gap really is sort of different than what we're talking about in terms of the traffic or in terms of the whatever. What the professor said may be correct, that maybe some of these other cities aren't going down the right path, or maybe we need to figure something out. Assuming that some of this needs to be done, assuming that clean air is a good thing and is saving money is a good thing, here's my question. It looks like Columbus is way ahead of us. I'm a Clevelander, but I lived in Pittsburgh for 2 years, and as in so many other aspects of economic development and civic leadership, Pittsburgh is kicking our butts in terms of smart cities. So my question is, who is focusing on this? Who is pushing this? Who is taking the leadership role in this? Or to ask it another way, why is Cleveland always behind the curve?
Anyone want to take a stab at that one? Who's our czar?
You know, that's a great question, and we have been behind in some things. There are other things I think we're ahead in, and we've come a long way. It's not an excuse. At the end of the day, you really do have to have this is a public good that we're trying to create, so we do have to have a city that's going to engage in this, or a county, or somewhere at the government level. We need people to pay attention to this. But I also think that we've got some things going on at our universities, and you know, we've made tremendous strides in the biomedical front, but I do think that IoT collaborative is a way focused on manufacturing or healthcare or some of the other places where we, again, may be able to take a little bit of a leapfrog and get ahead based on what we have.
So if I could just add one thing to what Dorothy just said. So this IoT collaborative that you're hearing a couple of times today, the Cleveland Foundation made a small but significant investment. They've given us a couple $1 million to CASE and CSU to help answer exactly the question that you're asking, which is why is Cleveland behind, right? And that's the central premise of what we're setting up. And as the universities started looking at this thing, we said, The universities aren't out there creating jobs. That's not the function of an academic institution. But one important function that the two universities together can serve is to serve as anchors and bring the people that can create the jobs, that can create the infrastructure, that can create the policies and the governance structures that we need, and convene these people together. And that's the function. That's one of the several functions that the IoT Collaborative is serving. And I have to say, we started last year, and we started these Wednesday morning meetings once a month of bringing all the different economic development folks in the city together. And it took us about 12 or 13 of these meetings to get to a point where everybody was actually pointed in the same direction, right? But we are there now, right? We are there now in the sense that we no longer have to start these meetings with, here's the list of things that we need to do to catch up with Pittsburgh, right? We've all got to that level of saying, here's where we're going, and now we're actually starting to synergize among each other's strengths and moving forward, right? So to your question of who's the anchor, and I agree with Dorothy that it has to be at some level the public sector and city government that has to come in and take ownership and leadership, but the universities are paving the way towards there.
And to give some historical perspective on maybe why Pittsburgh got ahead of Cleveland, we're the bigger city, the steel industry collapsed pretty quickly, and Pittsburgh was heavily dependent on that. Well, Cleveland was more diversified, so the economic loss in Cleveland was a lot slower. It's like if you look up and you have a huge gash on your arm, you might go to the hospital emergency immediately. But if it's a small cut, it gets worse over days, then you finally do something about it. When Pittsburgh lost so much of its employment suddenly within 1 decade, they quickly had to find an economic strategy and change something and looked at technology. Whereas in Cleveland, the loss was a lot slower, and so the response was a lot slower to fix it.
My name is Bill Bowen, and I'm the director of the PhD program here. And I've got 2 comments. One, first of all, for Ruth Bia's point on the system of systems. In one respect, I understand what you're saying with that and heading in that direction. But there's a basic issue there that goes right to what Nick is talking about. Do you suppose that system of system self-organizes, or is it designed? And if it's designed, then who's the designer? And how is that whole thing going to come about? And that leads me to my second point, because I have seen a smart city. I've spent quite a bit of time in one, which is Songdo in South Korea, and I've watched it get built.
The Solus smart city of Songdo?
Yeah, right outside of Seoul. And what I saw was a central government that decided to put this place together, and you could see it go up. I stood on top of a 65-story building that didn't have any occupants in it yet, and I looked out at apartment buildings for 250,000 people that had not yet moved in, and I saw the university buildings and the science park and the retail space. And, I mean, this whole thing was created the way we would create maybe a mall or a retail space. And they would accept that kind of structure of authority and amassing that much money. So I think it really does get down to how does the government, at least a lot of it gets down to how does the governance work for all this. And finally, I wanted to just point out that one of our former doctoral students, a guy named David Kazdan, has studied smart cities quite a bit over there, and he's made the point repeatedly in the things he's written that a lot of times the technology goes forward, but the social aspects, the policy, public policy lags behind it, right? The culture and the policy lags behind it, and that's critical stuff. So I'll stop there.
Just a point about, I think we're going to see, quite frankly, whether smart cities are designed or grow organically, because I think, as you said, in certain countries of the world, they are going to design them, right? Top down, create them. We see it happening, in the Middle East. We see it happening certainly in China. So I think we're going to see master planning versus the United States innovative 50,000 levels of government view, and we're going to see some very different outcomes because of that. So I think it's an interesting thing to watch, because it's a question of which succeeds for the population that it's serving and the society it's serving, right? So I think it's a really interesting question. You know, obviously ours here, I think, have to be a mix of design versus grow, because it has to be structured development, right? You want the chaotic system that exists where there's some chaos for innovation and design, and there's some order that provides a framework, which is why I think the strategy is important, right? The strategy and defining your mission gives you a framework how different departments or how different leaders might, you know, do that and implement that is different. And I will say the one picture everyone always shows of a smart city is like this big gleaming silver metropolis that looks really modern. And what I say, and I talk to cities a lot, is you want your city to look like your city. You don't want it to be this gleaming metropolis if that's not your brand and why people go to your city. So I think, you know, for Cleveland, for example, you want to find Cleveland rocks, right? Your city needs to look like your city, not like another smart city, right? Even if the underlying infrastructure is common or similar.
Hello, I'm Wayne Musker. I'm with the Alive Inside Foundation. I am the Creative Advocacy Director, and we became involved in working with people that have Alzheimer's and dementia through our film that talked about how that musical soundtrack that we carry around in our head can help these people regain some of their memories. We began a lot of intergenerational work after that film was completed, but one of our main priorities is to create dementia-friendly cities, and it is imperative, I would be remiss if I didn't say that, it is imperative for any city that claims to be a smart city to be dementia-friendly. The UK is way ahead of us. Other countries are ahead of us. We need dementia-friendly transportation. We need dementia-friendly housing that uses smart technology. We need dementia-friendly connectivity. And Dorothy, one of your main advocates should be, if you're not already connected with the lakefront, is my friend Marcy Capture, who is all about that. Anybody that's not connected with Meeting of the Minds, I'm sure you're familiar with them, should also be connected. They have another forum coming up on May 23rd at the Tech Hive here in Cleveland that I will be attending. And it's just an amazing initiative that we have to do, and it's a good possibility. I'm not sure. I'll have to do some more research, but Cleveland could become the first dementia-friendly U.S. smart city.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Oh, I'll take privilege and do two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say one of the things that I was very remiss on when I originally did our maturity model, and I talked about those indicators and what we were measuring, is that there was nothing about accessibility. So how you, and people called us on that, and so now we've made, in our new versions, really attentive to what's your performance indicators to making your city accessible to people of different abilities. I think that's sort of what you're saying when you even focus on dementia, so I think you're absolutely right.
Okay. Question in the back.
Hey, good evening. As a city planner, I can understand all the advantages of the technology and smart cities and connectivity, and as you've all talked about, it's all based on data collection. I also served on city council in my suburb for about 14 years, and then continued on to a safety committee after that. And the pushback we get from the citizens is about that data collection and what do you do with it. And you see the pushback in actuality of the red light cameras, which was a revenue producer for communities and traffic enforcement, and residents and communities are pushing back against that surveillance. And then recently at our safety committee, there's a county program about the license plate readers, and the question that was raised is if a government, a public body is collecting this data, and it goes to your question of who has the data and who controls it, and if the data is in the public domain, is it public? And we posed that to our law director, and he didn't really have an answer for that, because it is public information if it is paid for with public dollars. And so the question behind this is, how do you provide some comfort to communities who want to move ahead technologically, and for all the safety reasons and economic reasons, and yet have to answer the question about what is done with the data, who controls it, and who releases it, and why are you tracking me when I haven't done anything wrong?
Anyone want to respond to that?
I'll start. I don't think I'm probably not the best person, but it's not true that data held by the government is public. You know, there is categories of data, some of them being personally identifiable information, and there are, you know, there is nothing that says that the government needs to make open your personal information because they happen to hold it. I think it's really interesting, too, because there is a dichotomy where citizens often hold the government to a higher standard than companies, like Facebook, right? So my favorite example is Cambridge, which is with MIT and Harvard, which has no video cameras at all because their residents absolutely refuse to have any sort of surveillance, which is killing MIT because they really want to have a living lab and do stuff there. So part of it, I think, is educational about what is public and what open data means, and I think that is a really good way to talk to the community and educate the community. And the other fact of the matter is people have to be careful how they're using the data. And we'll make a dig at Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has a license plate reader parking system, right? You can't have privacy of where you're going in Pittsburgh because to park in their central business district, they track your license plate. So you have to be able to explain how data is used, and I think New York City has a whole series of guidelines where they say publicly, this is what we use your data for, this is our policy on how we use it, this is what we have a collection for. So there is the ability for cities to make guidelines or policy about that they share with the public to increase comfort. I'm happy, that's public, I can tell you the link that you can find the IoT guidelines for New York.
Do I have a minute, or?
Yeah, you can go ahead while the mic is coming to Catherine.
I'll try to be quick on this. So the example here is is culture or generational. I find really interesting with this, right? So I have two daughters, 22, one 22 today, and 20. And they think almost nothing about privacy. And so what I wrestle with this issue of privacy quite a bit, and I wonder about the same questions you do. How do we make residents feel secure about the information that we're gathering on them and that we're supposedly using for their own best interests, especially when we get into these open source and open data platforms and those types of things? I think the short answer is that I don't know that we can fully offer them security about that. I mean, we could try and we could pretend to. But the reality of those systems is that I think the data is going to be out there. And once it's out there, it's like the old Jurassic Park, you know, nature will find a way. And they will find a way to crack into that data in some way. So what are we left with? What are we left with, I think, is making people feel comfortable about their information and their personal information becoming public. I think that's a different question that might actually be answered generationally as opposed to with cultural trends rather than anything we might do with technology.
One more question, Catherine, real quick. Yep, right here.
So my question's along the same topic of using data, not just the privacy piece of it, but how data is used. So when we talk a little bit about collecting traffic data or something like that, I think people are at least willing to say, okay, if my car is giving you a sensor and some of that, there's questions about tracking where I move. But when we start going into smart technology and different things for personal information, personal data, how we use it in the social services sector, and how we're using it around that's around predictive analytics. Even in policing, predictive analytics, and then it also brings in a whole section about bias in the data that we already have. And so one of the things, at least what I've seen in some of my discussions and looks at smart cities, is building these collaborative ways of how we're doing it, bringing ethicists, bringing behavioral economics, bringing all of these different people from universities, public sectors, advocacy groups together. But I was wondering if anybody there has some good examples that we could look to as we try and build some of this governance and structure in our community of who's done that well, of bringing those different groups together to create those how should we even be using the data in this way to predict this or to look at this? Is it the right thing to do? And if it's the right thing to do, how do we do it in a way that's respectful and understanding of the biases and everything else that comes into social service?
One person got 1 minute.
I'll be very, I was going to say very briefly, with the algorithms that cities are using, or companies that are developing automatic responses for and a way to respond to things. So cities, we're recommending that cities try to see the algorithms, because there's biases in all of these. And even Microsoft had a bot where I think it was talking street talk back to the person, because it was learning it from other users. But there's all kind of biases built into the algorithms based on the programmers. It says it's all white males doing it, that it doesn't work for, other people or the general population. So cities should try to demand to see the algorithms, the biases, the logic that are used in the algorithms, and benchmark data to minimize the bias in these.
But I would say, too, really look at New York. We happen to work on this, so it sounds biased. I'm just going to put it. But they actually surveyed, we surveyed for them 20 companies, all their departments, all 85, 35 nonprofits, including the ACLU, which was incredibly helpful, by the way. You should talk to them about privacy and things. They're really good. And they collected all that feedback into these guidelines that really is governance. So they're public, they're online, they're general, but they're specific enough that they can get you in the right direction. So I suggest reading those as a place to start. It's very helpful.
And with that, I want to thank you all for staying around. I want to thank all my panelists for their constructive feedback to this conversation. As you can see, there's still a lot more for us to learn, a lot more for us to have additional dialogue on this to identify who is that czar that will lead us to the smart city promised land. But I think this is a good step in the right direction. Thank you, Dean England, for putting this event on, and he gave me privilege to basically close it out, so he can basically sit back and chill. And thank you for coming. Have a good day.